and it's about a country that's been mentioned on the stage maybe even more often than the US and Germany, and it's China, because China is evolving so fast. It's becoming so important and is still so mysterious for the most ignorant Westerners like I am, who know nothing about China and barely anything. So let me introduce to you a very interesting figure, one of the most popular experts on China, who lived in Peking and the US and worked for Baidu and Ogilvy. And last but not least, I like that fun fact, he founded and played the guitar in the first heavy metal band of China called the Tang Dynasty. This guy will lead you through approximately an hour with interesting speakers all about China, and here they are. Please welcome Kaiser Kuo and Christine Schikupfer. Welcome, and Bauman Su. That is you.
Hi, good to meet you.
Welcome on stage.
Thank you.
So Kaiser, you're the boss.
Thanks, Kaiser.
All right, I'm the boss.
You got it.
I'm the Kaiser, as it were. Thank you so much for having me. Let me very quickly first, before I begin, introduce you very quickly to Mr. Bowen Zhou. Bowen was the lead scientist on one of the most famous AI platforms in the world today, IBM's Watson. About 18 months ago, he joined one of China's leading AI company, one of China's leading e-commerce companies, heading AI there, JD.com, and now he's got all sorts of very interesting things to say about that. I'd also like to introduce Dr. Christine Schikupfer, who I had the pleasure of having a podcast with earlier today that will be online on OMR Podstars that you should listen to, who has just produced a tremendous report at Merix, where she works, about the digital the challenges that Europe faces from China's digital rise. I've been asked, please take a seat. I'm going to make a few remarks first. I've been asked to talk a little bit about China's technology ecosystem. I've had the great honor and really the great good fortune of being a first-hand observer of China's technology development across a period of roughly 20 years. I was in China starting my first internet company, well, not starting, but was one of the first hires for an internet company in 1999, and so worked for a number of years as a technology reporter before joining one of China's biggest internet companies, Baidu, the leading search engine in China, as Director of International Communications. I left China in 2016 and now live in the United States, but in that time I've watched China really develop into a fully fledged ecosystem of technology. There were specifically two cities, in the city of Beijing and the city of Shenzhen. I've watched it develop armies of entrepreneurs, ample supplies of venture capital, a real culture of entrepreneurship, all the ancillary supporting infrastructure that's necessary for a technology ecosystem to really flourish. Things like accounting firms and law firms, and probably most importantly, just sort of the supply chain, the manufacturing part of it that really has given China such an advantage in its technology ecosystem. But I think there's one piece of the tech ecosystem in China that probably doesn't receive the amount of attention that it probably deserves. And I think it's fair to say that in any country, and I think it's especially so in China, there's a quite distinct matrix of culture and society in which technology is both developed and consumed. And in China, that has quite distinct characteristics that I want to talk about. Watching it up close, I was able to come to very different conclusions about the way that technology works in China than a lot of observers who I'm familiar with outside of China, in the United States, or say here in Europe. And I wanted to share some of my thoughts. There were really two narratives, I think, that dominated our thinking about technology and its relationship with authoritarian politics in China. And both of these narratives have, in very recent years, completely flipped. I'm not talking about sort of a gradual transition from one way of thinking to another, but a sudden 180-degree turn, which has made me very suspicious both about the narrative as it used to exist and the narrative as it exists now. The first of these, about the relationship between authoritarian politics and technology, was this idea that in order to be innovative, you had to have an environment of essentially political freedom, that somehow you had to have the free flows of information in order for a country to be, so that, there was maybe this notion that, we were disabused of it later, that you had to know the truth of what happened 30 years ago in Tiananmen Square, or you wouldn't be able to develop a smartphone app. It was a very strange idea, but it's one that persisted for a long time, and it manifested itself in this genuine sort of disregard for, a disparagement, very common disparagement of China's capacity to actually innovate. There was this idea that C2C didn't stand in the Chinese context for consumer to consumer, but it stood for copy to China. And to some extent this was true. There were a lot of business models that were simply copied over. That idea has completely flipped on its head somehow just in the last few years. Even maybe 3 years ago, you had then Vice President Joe Biden going around, not campaigning, but making speeches at universities where he would speak very dismissively of China's capacity to innovate. Carly Fiorina, who many of you know was the CEO of Hewlett-Packard, and who probably should have known better, would challenge people when she was on the campaign trail in 2015 to name even one thing that China had actually innovated. Apparently nobody in the audience had WeChats on their phone, or they might have drawn very different conclusions. My point here is that suddenly, 2, maybe 3 years ago, we suddenly believed that China was this unstoppable technology juggernaut that was going to roll everyone over in its path, and it was going to out-innovate us all and really eat our lunch here in the West. I think that we were as wrong now when we hyperventilate and we exaggerate as we were then when we tended to be so dismissive about China's capacity to innovate. I think that we had a fundamentally wrong misunderstanding then, and we have a fundamentally wrong misunderstanding now. The other narrative, I think, that took hold in the American imagination, especially in the United States, was this idea somehow that technology was going to be the death knell to authoritarian regimes around the world, that they wouldn't survive the onslaught of a population that was armed with social media. And we really believed this as we handily appended the names of American social media properties beginning in the later color revolutions and through some of the other political revolts that we saw through the 2000s and into the 2010s. Things like Moldova, which was the first of several Twitter revolutions, and then the Facebook revolution in Tahrir Square. Before that, the YouTube revolution in the streets of Iran after the re-election of Ahmadinejad. We had these notions very much embedded in us that technology was going to subvert authoritarian politics. And what has happened in the time since? We've flipped our narrative entirely again. We've come to believe somehow that technology is the trusty handmaiden of authoritarian regimes the world over, that technology, especially when it comes from authoritarian states like China, is necessarily it carries somehow the seed of authoritarianism itself. And so that's made us very suspicious now of technologies that we see coming, suspicious of China's intentions as it develops technology. And it's led to a kind of techno-orientalism where we ascribe to China's technology companies, to all the actors in technology, the ecosystem of China, this sort of malicious intent, this malevolence. I think we need to really think carefully about this because I think it's a very harmful narrative. And again, it's as untrue as our techno-utopian ideas about the relationship between authoritarian politics and technology before. So I would suggest, though, that, as I said, technology is developed and consumed in a country like China in a very particular cultural and social matrix. And I wanted to, maybe in the time that I have left, talk a little bit about what some of the features of that are and give you maybe some idea. Because it is very different in China. For a whole bunch of different reasons, Chinese people do not have the same sort of suspicion of technology that that has come to be quite standard, quite commonplace, really very ubiquitous in the West. In China, you do not have the leading technologists or the leading scientists intoning dire warnings about sentient AI and its potentially existential threat to society. We don't have people who, like Elon Musk or Bill Gates, are talking about summoning the demon of AI. We don't have people like the late Stephen Hawking who talked about the dangers, the perils that AI was going to pose to us. That is, on the one hand, perhaps a good thing. On the other hand, it has, I think, stifled conversation about ethics around artificial intelligence. We don't hear that routinely in conversation when you're in China. In fact, China is one of these few places left in the world where there is an unembarrassed embrace of the idea of bright, technologically driven futures. And why shouldn't they think so? After all, for the last at least 20 years, Chinese people have seen their lives improve materially, even spiritually, in lockstep with the improvements that they've seen in technology in their lives. So they have not developed really the same sense of suspicion toward it. Part of that, I think, lies in the Chinese pedagogical system, in the way that things are taught in school. There is a real privilege given to people who study the natural sciences and especially engineering. Parents who raise children, if they want them to succeed in Chinese society, will push them into the STEM fields rather than into the social sciences and the humanities. And this, of course, poses all sorts of problems as well, but it also makes sure that there's a steady supply of quite talented coders coming out of the major Chinese technology universities like Tsinghua University. Now, I would say that a part of it is also nested in China's political system. China, I think more than any other country in the world, is the most deeply technocratic polity probably on the face of the earth. A huge percentage of China's top echelon of leaders, until very recently especially, were trained in the natural sciences and especially in engineering. It was the one sort of reliable path to career, to personal, and even to political success in China. So there's perhaps no wonder why this would have been given that privilege. I think you could say that China, in many ways, has become the land of nerd empowerment. And then perhaps that's a good thing. Perhaps it is not. But I think that's something that we should all reflect on and think about as we think about the technology ecosystem in China. I would say that if there is one thing that I would look at in Chinese society versus Western society as an indicator of this tendency, it's in science fiction. When we create science fiction, we are projecting ourselves into a future. We're imagining, what the future is like, and by its very nature, the genre asks us to imagine the relationship with technology, right? That is at the very heart of what science fiction is, what science fiction does. And in China, you'd be very hard put to find the kind of dystopian science fiction that you have so commonly here in the West. Now, I'm not talking just about the United States, but also in Germany and in the UK. What was the most popular recent science fiction television series? It was on Netflix. Black Mirror. How many of you have seen this show, Black Mirror? Right. It's built entirely, it's a very clever, wonderful show. I highly recommend it. But it's built entirely on the ways in which technology can go awry, can create all sorts of very deeply troubling social problems in our societies. China is not like that at all. I would go so far as to say that while the United States is in its Black Mirror phase, where, with the exception of perhaps a short story called Arrival, which was turned into a movie, which, by the way, was written by a Chinese American named Ted Chiang. With that singular exception, almost all the other science fiction that has come out in the West has been deeply dystopian. It's quite the opposite in China. So while the United States is still quite stuck, I think, and it's true for many other Western countries as well, in its Black Mirror phase, China is still very much in its Star Trek phase. There's still this belief that technology can really create better societies. And again, I think that that's something that has grown out of the lived experience of being in a country where technology not only is the ladder to success, but has yielded palpably better improvements in life.